So, we are sitting here in the Judaica suite in the University of Florida Special Collections Judaica Library. Today is the 27th of February 2019, and I'm conversating with
Perla Sneh.
So my first question is about your parents. If you could tell us where your parents were born and what their professions were.
Well, my mother was born in Poland in a little town called Vlodava, but she came to Argentina when she was like 2-3 months old. So she was practically Argentinian. She grew up in Argentina. She was declamadora, how do you say that to recite. Mm-hmm. She studied acting, mm-hmm. and she recited. She was very known in her youth as one that recites poems, and she was a teacher at the Jewish school net. And my father, he was born also in Poland. I'm completely Polish. He was born in a little town named Puławy. And he came to Argentina much later. He was, when the war started, he was in Warsaw. He went back to his town and stayed there for a week. And he understood that he understood that the Nazis were going to kill everyone. It was not like the first World War, because everybody thought, well, the German, they had the idea of the Germans from the First War. But my father said, no, we have to leave. He tried to convince his family, no one paid attention. Only the two brothers went with him. They went to Lvov on the Soviet side, on the other side of the Bug River. And they stayed there until the Nazis declared war to the Soviet Union. And one of his brothers went back to Poland. The other one was killed in the Lvov pogrom that the Ukrainians did to welcome the Nazis. And my father went into the Red Army. And he went away with the Red Army until a certain point where he was left out of the Red Army, went to Tashkent in Uzbekistan. There he found out that there was a Polish army that was being organized by the Polish government in exile, led by General Anders. And he went there, he very curiously, he went in because they didn't take Jews, but it was a mistake. Someone with a name very, very similar to my father's name had bribed the doctor to take him into the army, and the doctor made a mistake and took my father and not the other one. So he went into the Polish army. And with the Polish army came to Jordan. What's now Jordan, it wasn't that time. And from there he went to Palestine. He left the army And because of that, he had to change his name. His former family name was Rosenblatt, and he changed his name to Sneh. And being already Simcha Sneh, he went into the Jewish brigade of the British Army. He wanted to go back to Europe to fight. And in Europe, when he was with the brigade they mostly fought in Italy. And then he was part of the Brigade. And when he was about to be demobilized, he got a letter from a friend that was in Argentina, and he told, my father wanted to be demobilized in Palestine, but the friend told me, come to Argentina for a few months, you'll rest, you'll get your strength back, and then you'll go to Palestine. And he came to Argentina and he met my mother and he stayed. That was the year 1948.
So he arrived to Argentina before Israel was founded?
No, in the same year, because
Yeah.
Israel was born in May 14. I think a few months later he was.
So he was there when Israel was founded?
No, he was in London, I think, when Israel was founded, and then he came to Argentina. And when he was in London, he was already a journalist for a Yiddish newspaper in London, and from London he used to send notes to Die Presse in Buenos Aires. And my mother fell in love with him before she met him, because she had read a kind of a little story that my father wrote that was a very romantic tale about the 1st of May. It's called Mein Hand is a Zeuviafon. My hand is like a banner. It's a tale of someone that is in the 1st of May manifestation.
Manifestation.
And he cuts his hand, and the blood makes it red, so his hand is like a red banner of and it was very funny because they met. My mother was an actress, and she recited, and when my father went to an act, I don't know, something in a Yiddish school, in the Sholem Aleichem school, where my mother was a teacher, but she recited in that event, I don't know what it was. And my father wrote a note saying that the Lehrerke Berta Bialy, who also knows how to recite, said such and such poem. And my mother was outraged. How dare he? She was the big reciter, and this greenhorn comes and says, who also knows that. And then she called to made a call to the newspaper to shout at him, and my father asked her to go to have coffee, and they got hooked.
Nice. So was the 1st of May celebrated in Argentina?
The 1st of May is very, no, it's the 1st of May of the Communist Party. It's the laborers, the workers' day. And it was a time when the left was very present in Jewish community, and that's why.
So did they organize like not protests, but celebrations out in the public?
Yes. It was very. But the thing was that the story was so romantic that my mother
So you were born in Buenos Aires?
I was born in Buenos Aires. I have an older brother. His name is Marcelo Menachem, like my grandfather, Menachem Mendel. We called him Mendele. He lives in Beersheba with his family. I'm the middle one. My name is Deborah Perla, Dvoire Perl, or Perele. Dvoire Perl were my father's two sisters, so I have their names. And I have a younger sister, Paloma Taibele. Taibele was my father's mother name. And she has a second name. She's Paloma Raquel Taibel Rochl. That was my mother's. Rochl was my mother's grandmother, and she lives in Buenos Aires. She plays the saxophone. She's a very, very good musician.
So I understand that your grandparents from your mother's side, they were present in your childhood.
Very present. They were very present. They came to Argentina in 1922, the year my mother was born. And they lived in the outskirts of Buenos Aires in a place called Valentin Alsina. That was a very not center place. They were very present. I was telling yesterday to one of the people that was in the conference, we were talking about Jewish food, and I told her my grandmother used to make wine for Pesach. She had, ¿cómo se dice una parra? Una vid donde crecen las uvas. Grape.
Like a winery? Like wines?
Yes.
She grew her own wine?
Her own grape plant, and she took the grapes and made wine for Pesach, and she was a very, very good cook. And they were very nice. My grandfather also, Motul Biali, he was a carpintero.
Like
que trabaja con madera.
Like a woodworker.
A woodworker. Yeah. I have a library. ¿Cómo se llama?
Like shelf system that he
at home that he made. And he was a very, very dear person. I always thought that he's one of the 36. I always said that one of the 36, the Lamed Vav, lives in Valentin Alsina. That was my grandfather.
So what was the language that you spoke at home?
We spoke Spanish. My father and mother, they spoke in they met in Yiddish because my mother didn't speak Polish or any other language. That she spoke Yiddish, but Yiddish and Spanish, and my father didn't speak a word in Spanish, although he spoke like, 6 languages at the time, like every Jew of that time, they spoke everything. And they met in Yiddish, and all the romance was in Yiddish.
And did they ever switch to Spanish, or it remained?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, with time they switched. But when I was little, they used to speak Yiddish between them. They spoke Yiddish. Not my mother. My mother spoke to me in Spanish. My father spoke to me in Yiddish, but I answered in Spanish usually. but I also learned Yiddish at school. I went to two schools. In the morning, I went to the state school, Argentinian school, regular, and in the afternoon, I went to Yiddish school. So, and this was a school, the Sholem Aleichem Shul, that was Linke Polizeion. So we had Yiddish and Hebrew because it was a Yiddishist and also Zionist. So we spoke Yiddish and Hebrew and learned both languages. And I learned Torah and Jewish history and everything, but in both languages.
And your grandparents, did they learn Spanish?
They learned Spanish, but they didn't learn how to read and write. They were literate only in Yiddish, not in Spanish. But to speak, they learn. They spoke with the grandchildren. They try always to speak in Spanish, so they would be more.
And did they have a circle of friends? Like, do you think that they were integrated into?
Yes, they had. Where they were, they founded the shul, and there were other people from the same town. Yesterday you spoke about not you, someone else, sorry, spoke about Landsmannschaften. Well, that they were in the Landsmannschaft of Blodava, and they had friends, and they were very active in the community. My grandmother was part of the, she was in the Vizo. The ladies of the Vito, and my grandfather made the aron as a woodworker. He made the aron for the shul.
Carpenter.
A carpenter, and well, they were very involved, and they had many friends. Yeah.
And do you have memories when the two, when your grandparents meet your mother, like, or not memories, but memories that they were talking about? How was the encounter between, not your grandparents, when your grandparents, the parents of your mother, meet your father?
Oh, that was, my grandmother suspected him, and they didn't like the idea. He's, you don't know where he comes from, he's alone, you don't know how many women he left in the... They hated him. They had no trust at all in him, and they live in that place was, as I told you, Valentin Alsina, and it was a place very, very not developed. The streets were of, there was no pavement, and you had to cross a river that is called the Riachuelo, that is stinky. So my father called the place where they lived, he called it Stinkograd. So we were going to Stinkograd.
So Grad, is, just to explain, Grad is a Slavic word basically
yes.
for city, and Stinko is like stinking. So the city of stink.
Yes. And the first time my father went there, the whole family gathered there, and my mother went with my father there, and my grandmother's sister, Tia Malke. I very, very much loved her. The Tia Malke made canelones, and they were overcooked and hard as a stone, and my father couldn't eat them. And everybody sat around the table and looked at him. And he was the only one eating, and everybody was looking at him. Wow. Anyhow, with time they learned to love him, but at that time they were. He was a kind of a strange figure, a soldier. He was a soldier. First of all, he was a survivor, but a soldier. He was not in any ghetto or camp. So he passed all the war. Like he has a book. It's not one book. It's a complete saga, 6 volumes of his wanderings around during the war. That's called Navenat. You know, it's and.
Which means that he wanders around.
He wandered around during all the 6 years of the war, and he came to Argentina, and he was a strange figure, and a poet, and a journalist, and my grandmother had no trust at all at him. She was very, very suspicious. And everybody was amazed with him. They looked at him like, but he settled down. I know that when my parents got married, the friends that were there, their friends, mostly my mother's friends, but also my father had friends there. They were betting how long they will stay married. The one that mostly, the most time said 6 months. They were married almost 50 years. My father passed away, but that year they wanted to renew their marriage, to make again a chuppah.
So when they get married, this is a traditional Jewish wedding.
Yes.
And this is a year or 2 years, or how long have your father been?
Very fast. They got married in 49.
Okay, so he's basically a year in Argentina when he gets married. But I understand that when he arrives to Argentina, when he arrives in Buenos Aires, he already has contacts, like he has a name through the papers.
Yes.
Right? So he can create an existence, like he can keep himself already he has job perspectives, basically. He
had no specific job perspective, but at that time he was a member of the ICUF, the Communist Yiddish Party. His first book in Argentina was edited by the ICUF. And they gave him a job in their office. But later with my mother, they started, because you cannot live from being a journalist or a teacher or a writer. That's in Argentina, no one lived of that. Everybody was a writer in Argentina, but everybody had another
a day job.
Yeah, sure. And my father and my mother started to make sweaters.
They knitted? Or?
No, they bought the wool and gave it to people that had 1 or 2 machines at home, and they started to sell. And with time, they rented their own shop, and then they bought it, and then they sold everything. And it wasn't a good idea to sell everything, but that's ancient history. But my father never lived from his intellectual. There were no scholarships, no nothing at that time. There were no such things.
And I didn't ask you, so before the war, did he study something?
Yes, he studied at the university, the Free University in Poland. He studied history and philosophy.
I see. So but he couldn't finish.
He couldn't finish, and he had no papers at all. He studied at the gymnasium first. There was numerus clausus, and he was one of. In his town, it was a very little town, but the prince, it was called Prince Czartoryski, had horses. He was a man who loved horses, so he made a kind of university for agronomy in town. So it was a very intellectual town. And the gymnasium was also, Gymnasium Prince Czartoryski was very, very respected. And my father went to study there. I know that when his grandfather found out that he was going to attend the gymnasium, he said he will only go to gymnasium if he learns a Blättel Gemurre every day, a page of the Talmud every day. So it was, that was because my grandmother, his mother, wanted her children to learn. So the three boys studied. It was a Jewish school net in town, but my father went to the Polish gymnasium because it was better. And also Dora and Nina, Deborah, Perla, my two aunts, they also learned. They were teachers. One was a teacher for French, I think, and the other was a teacher in chemistry or something. I'm not sure. But the thing is, my grandmother wanted her children to learn. So my father went to, and then when he was in Warsaw, when he went to Warsaw, he studied at what was called the Free University. I cannot say it in Polish. It's a word, but I wouldn't be able to pronounce it. And then in Argentina, he wanted to go on and learn, and it was impossible. It was impossible.
So his first book comes out under the aegis of the Communist Party?
Yes, the first book was, I think, Blätter auf dem Wind. It's poetry.
And this means the pages of...
Blätter auf dem Wind, pages in the wind. And later he published Auf fremde Wegen in foreign roads, lands. He has also a theater piece. It's called Das Geschrei in der Nacht, I Cry in the Night. And later he was very involved with Yiddish literature. He was a teacher of Yiddish literature in the school net, in the high school, and also at the midrashah. That was where the students that wanted to be teachers in the Jewish school net had to learn. And he was there was a Yiddish Writers Union in Buenos Aires that on the name of Nomberg, H.D. Nomberg, and my father was the president. And then he published a book in Spanish, so they threw him away. He couldn't be no longer the president of the Yiddish writers because he had published. And it was very funny because there was a critic that had with him a very, very hard argument, and my father tried to explain to him, I'm like Shimon Frug. Shimon Frug was a Yiddish Russian writer that wrote both in Yiddish and in Russian. So my father said, okay, but it's not that I'm abandoning Yiddish, I'm enriching my horizon with Spanish and opening my my work to a wider horizon. And he said, I'm doing the same as Frug did, and the other was out of himself and shouting and said, Frug is dead. When you'll be dead, you'll do whatever you want, but now you cannot be anymore the president of the Yiddish Writer Union, and that's it.
So being the president of the Yiddish Writers Union, it means that probably he was very well known, but he also had very widespread connections in the literary circles, the Yiddish literary circles. So I assume as a child or as a young adult you witnessed...
I knew everyone. I knew all the Yiddish writers. They came home and I was amazed by them because they talk and were so passionate about what they're saying. They drank a lot, and they shout, and it was, these people is crazy. For me it was very, very amazing, and none of my friends I had parents like that. They were, I always thought as a child that I could ask a friend of mine, what does your father do? And she would say, or he would say, he's a teacher, or he's a dentist, or he's an engineer. One word. And they ask me, what does your father do? Well, he's a teacher, but he's also a writer, and he teaches at school, and you live from them? No, we have a little shop. And it was half an hour to explain what my parents do, and I envy those children that could answer with one word.
And your mother, so were your mother also present in these meetings?
Yes, my mother was also present, and my mother was very, very involved in my father's work. She supported him all his life. I remember my father was at the AMIA when it blew up. And luckily, he was saved. And I remember I was the first to find him in the hospital where he was. And when I came there, the nurse asked me, are you Berta? Berta was my mother. No, but he's asking for Berta, it's driving me crazy. And my father, with time, they got very, very dependent on each other. And my mother had a very big presence in his work.
But he was in his 70s at the AMIA bombing.
81.
Okay.
He was 81.
Yeah, okay. And was he injured?
He was injured, not Well, he was injured, mostly from pieces of
metal.
Glass.
Yeah, glass. Okay.
That and he something got him on the.
Hit him.
Un golpe en la cabeza.
He got like a hit by something.
Yes, he got hit by something, and actually he left the building before it came down, crumbled down, because between the explosion and the
collapse,
there were a few, maybe a minute or two, and in that time he went out, and then he collapsed and woke up in the hospital. And he was also in the embassy. He was with my mother at the embassy, and they left 20 minutes before the bomb.
At the Israeli embassy?
Yes.
Oh, so he was on both occasions?
On both.
That's horrible.
And yes. It was very, and I don't know, he told me he was very, very upset. I remember when afterwards he was already at home and we were watching the news, and they read the names of all the dead, and they were all people he knew, and many of them were young people. And he was so upset, and he said, I'm sitting here reading the newspaper, that's not fair. And I don't know, he told me when he went from Europe to Argentina, he went first to Brazil, and from Rio he took a plane to Paraguay. And the flight was very, very shaky, and on his side there was a nun. And when the plane started to shake, the nun fell on her knees and started to pray. And he said, I'm an idiot. I survived all the war to come and die here like an idiot in a stupid plane. But luckily nothing happened, and he came beshalom to Paraguay, and he went into Argentina illegally. He didn't had a visa. He went illegally to Argentina through the river. That's why he went to Paraguay, because there he took a boat through the Paraná River and entered illegally with a friend that was waiting for him. It's another long story. So everything is a long story.
So he becomes like a center, for like a very central figure for the Yiddish literary circles.
He was an important figure.
And you know all these illustrious and less important persons who come to visit your house.
Yeah.
And then he turns and he starts writing also in Spanish.
Yes.
And if you could say a few words about that. And
he started to, first of all, he was very fond of Argentinian literature. There is a writer, a very special writer that was called Roberto Arlt, kind of a Dostoevskian figure. He has a very big influence of Dostoevsky in his writing, and my father was very fond of him, and he made a big effort to read it, and then he started to read voraciously Argentinian writers. He wrote, And then he started to translate his own work into Spanish and rewrite it, Überdichten, to re-poeticize his own work in another language. The Navenad was published, not all of it, but the first 2 volumes were published in Yiddish as a feuilleton, one part each week in Die Presse. And then it was published all together, the first 2 volumes as a book. But then he started to rewrite the Navenad in Spanish. And in Spanish, he published all 6 volumes.
So it's Sin Rumbo.
Sin Rumbo, it's called in Spanish. And he didn't know, there is a book, already was a book in Spanish that was called Sin Rumbo, from an Argentinian writer. And then in 2013 or 14, I don't remember, 15, I made selection of different chapters of the 6 volumes and made one unique volume that the National Library in Argentina published it. That was a very important thing. I think he would have loved it because he was very eager to be a part of Argentinian literature, and he befriended many important Argentinian writers like Ernesto Sábato, Marco de Nevi, Abelardo Castillo. Those were very renowned writers. I remember them also at home, when coming at home and talking. Everybody was, they were very amazed by my father's figure because he was kind of a strange type, you know. The fact that he was a soldier, the fact that he was in places like Buzuluk, Tashkent, you know. But it's today with globalization, these are names that are everyday names. But back then it was kind of from another planet, something like that. And he spoke strange languages
And could you say a few words how he starts his journalistic work?
He started to write for Yiddish journals already in London. But then when he started to publish in Spanish, different newspapers asked him for notes. I remember, for instance, when Agnon and Nelly Sachs got the Nobel Prize, they asked him to make in one of the big newspapers in Buenos Aires. And there were he had many invitations to write. He wrote about Yiddish, about Jerzy Kosinski, about many subjects.
And also, could you say a few words about when he becomes an editor? He founded
Yes,
several
he
newspapers.
That was part of his involvement in the Jewish community. He wanted to make a journal, so to reach the non-Jewish community. So it had to have it had to be in Spanish. So first in the 60s he founded a review journal that was half in Yiddish, half in Spanish, no? And he did it with a friend of his, Aaron Yurkevich. They both made this review, I don't know, revista, review.
This is Aleph? This is Aleph?
It was Aleph. It was called Aleph, and it was very, very particular. It didn't went long. There were only 3 numbers, 3 editions, but it's very, very interesting. The collection is now here. I think it's the only place where the collection is. So, then in the 60s, almost 69, 70, he founded a journal named Raíces, Roots. The title was Raíces, la revista judía para el hombre de nuestro tiempo. Roots, the Jewish review for the man of our times. And it was very, very new. It was in Spanish about Jewish themes, but not only Jewish themes. It had sections on Israel, on Europe, on Argentinian politics, on culture, cinema, theater, schools, everything, and many important writers and journalists, Argentinian journalists and writers, published their notes in Raíces, and it reached the non-Jewish community. It was very something very not seen before, that a Yiddish or a Jewish review was sold in any kiosk, in any place. It was sold, people bought it, so it was, and it came to, there were psychoanalysts writing in it, and writers and journalists, and many important names were present there.
And do you know how he organized it? If he had like some financial support?
He founded it, and he thought of it and everything, and it was sustained by the Organización Sionista de Argentina, the OSA, the Zionist organization in Argentina. They sustain it.
And but this was before the coup.
Yes, that was
much before.
Much before.
And did
the
it
coup
last?
was in '76. This is the '70s.
And this is did it last until the coup? Or
I
after?
don't know, because there was my father was the director there for a few years. Then we made Aliyah, that is, my brother and I made Aliyah, and then they came to Israel in '73, my parents and my little sister, and they came just before the Yom Kippur War. And I know the magazine, that was the word I didn't find. The magazine went on a few years. After my father, Moshe Roit, Zichrono Libracha, was the director, and then it was another director that I don't remember the name, but I don't remember how much time. It lasted a few years, but I couldn't know. And also there was the first, at least the first and the second editions of the magazine had the front page, or la tapa.
The front page, the cover.
The cover was a picture by Leon Poch, a very, very renowned artist, also from Poland. They were very good friends, my father and Leon. We lived in the same building. They lived in the second floor, we lived in the fourth floor. They were very, very close friends. And they made together an album that you also have here, Jews of My Childhood, that are pictures
Yes.
by Leon Poch with epigraphs that my father wrote.
And were their friendship, I assume it was founded in Buenos Aires, like
yes.
they met in Buenos Aires.
They met in Buenos Aires.
And basically they were the makers or very important columns of that literary, artistic
yes.
circles that
yes,
you
and
just
they also took part in, there was a newspaper of the linke Poezion that was called Unser Wort, our word. And my father wrote there, and Leon made cartoons. It was very a very renowned cartoonist also. And he was known outside the Jewish community. He made cartoons in a very, very popular magazine called Paturusu. And yeah.
But he was a political cartoonist, right? Like
in the Yiddish papers, he made political cartoons. Yeah.
And how was his politics and your father's politics?
They were very close, and they were both linke Poezion.
So you go to Israel, and
yes.
then they follow. And
yes.
can you tell us how long you were there and what did you do there?
I was in Israel almost 7 years. At the beginning, I was in a kibbutz, Mishmar HaNegev, in the south. My kibbutz Agshama, that is the kibbutz I was meant to go, was Sde Nahum in the north, but I didn't go there. I went to Jerusalem, and I was there, and I studied at Bezalel, the art academy. I studied ceramics, and later I wanted to go back to Argentina. I couldn't. I had to go back to Argentina. I had to, and it was the 76th, the year. It was November. In March, there was a coup d'etat, and I remember sitting with my friends from Bezalel, and the teacher, the English teacher, asked, well, what are you going to do? Everyone was saying what he plans to do. And I said, I'm going back to Argentina. And she looked at me and said, you're kidding. No, I have to go. I don't know. I had to. I knew what was happening. We knew very, very well. But, you know, you don't think.
And your parents returned
They
with you?
were already returned a year before.
They
because my father couldn't find. He was very disappointed. He had no good job. No one recognized his. They offer him a job at the Mashbir Latzarkhan to sell, I don't know. And it was very, very disappointing for him.
And how was it for your mother?
And my mother, she was more adaptable. Now, also in Israel, he worked. They had a magazine, Folk und Zion, and my father worked at Folk und Zion. But it was very, it was a very small circle. They were used to many people, to, something more open. So they went back to.
And was it starting all over, or he could?
More or less starting all over again, because they had sold the shop and they had sold the house, and then he started to work at the Amia, like. I remember he used to say, "Why not?" Peretz was a writer, and he worked for the Jewish community, writing, this, for the Chevra Kedisha, writing little peteks for the Chevra Kedisha. But the rest of his life he worked in the Amia.
So you return also to Argentina with a diploma of pottery, of ceramics.
Yes.
And then what do you do?
And then I worked as a ceramist for a few years, and then I wanted to study psychology. So I went into the university. I really wanted to study psychoanalysis, but to be a psychoanalyst, you have to have, in Argentina, you have to have a degree. So I studied psychology, and then I made my training as a psychoanalyst. And then in the meantime, I married, I had children, 2 beautiful boys. One of them is getting married very soon. Don't push me, I'll show you the picture. I studied, I worked as a psychoanalyst, and I started to get interested in research on the Shoah. Understandably, I have a background, the stories of my father and everything, but I started to get interested from inside the psychoanalytical environment to get interested in the Shoah, and then I made a PhD on social sciences around the subject was language and extermination. So I made my PhD is on that subject. I worked on German language as a language that organized an extermination. I worked the Yiddish language as a language that resisted extermination, and Spanish as a language to transmit, the transmission of the history of because in Argentina with the coup d'etat we had a very, very terrible situation with 30,000 people that disappeared, and there is a close connection between the way Jews harbor their memory and how Argentinians started to work their own memory. There is a connection. So that's the subject I worked on my PhD, and now I'm in the I'm a researcher at the Center for Genocide Studies at the University of 3 de Febrero. That's not where I studied. I studied in the Universidad de Buenos Aires. They're both national universities. And I studied both psychology and the PhD on social sciences. I made it in the Universidad de Buenos Aires. And also in the Universidad de 3 de Febrero, where I'm now, we have their master degree on cultural diversity. And they have their 4 specialties: Arab studies, Jewish studies, Afro-American studies, and indigenous studies. We call it originally peoples, pueblos originarios. And I'm the director or the academic coordinator of the Jewish studies specialty.
So do you think that the situation in Argentina and in the 70s and your background, they kind of shepherded you towards the topic?
Yeah.
It was a reaction to your...
Yes. Almost anybody in Argentina has a friend who disappeared. So me too. I had a friend, and a very good friend. I knew him from Yiddish school. There were many Jews involved in
disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
many Jews were disappeared. Like many
Yes.
Jews were even if they were both involved in resistance, but also without
and
disappeared.
Also both things. And actually Jews are overrepresented in that because Jews are like 1 or 2% of the total population and are like almost 20% of the disappeared, so it's overrepresented. I wrote another book which I wrote it with a friend of mine, Dr. Juan Carlos Cosaca. We wrote about the language in the Shoah, and it's called La Shoah en el siglo, del lenguaje del exterminio, el exterminio del discurso. It's the Shoah on the century, from the language of extermination to the extermination of the discourse. And this book is dedicated to a friend of mine, Pepe. We call him Ershele Urfeig, Zichronon Libracha, who disappeared. Yes, I'm sure all this had this and the stories of my father and well, the memories that if we don't tell them, they will be lost. So
I have 2 questions. One is that did your father have a guilt of survival? Like was it something that he transmitted to you? I take it as a yes. I mean, like if you could say a few words about how this, like what was the tenor of his stories, or how he kind of placed himself into the story where he remains alone, I assume. And also, how was his reaction when you started, you created a professional path that these stories kind of were viewed not only as a part of the family memory, but as like taking a professional point of view on the...
Well, that I'll start from the second one, because he didn't think of this as only a family memory. He himself wrote a lot about the Shoah, about how to preserve memory, and that was not shock for him. On the contrary, he was very pleased that I took this subject and went on with it in my own way. But he himself, he also had, I wouldn't say professional, but kind of an intellectual approach to what happened, and it was very important for him to think about how to transmit memories. That was very important for him. And as for how he used to tell the stories, it was very strange, because he had very, very terrible stories to tell, but he told them in a kind of... it's like when you read his stories, his language is very easy. There are no grave words. There are very simple words, and even joyful words, or kind of, it's like you read a terrible story but in the language of a fairy tale. So it's strange. He could laugh when he spoke about his parents, his sisters, but then at night he used to scream in his dreams. He spoke in Polish, in Russian, I don't know what, and it was very... it happened a lot that in the middle of the night you hear the scream, and that was him, my father, dreaming. But when he spoke very easy, very... it was also, when he spoke publicly, he was very militant. He was very single-minded, and he was... But people knew him, they knew he had a character. He could be very tokpani, aggressive. He could be very aggressive. He could fight. I don't know, I remember once there was kind of an homage they made for a very, very known Argentinian writer that is called Ernesto Sábato. Is one of the big figures. He was my father's friend. That was organized by the a Jewish German community, and Sábato said, "Okay, I'll go if you invite Simcha Sneh." So we went there. I went with my father, my mother and me, we went there. And before the act, we were sitting in a place, they brought us something to drink, and there was Sabato, the German ambassador, and my father. And Sabato and the German ambassador were talking about Goethe and German poetry and this and that, and my father stood there and said nothing, and then Sabato turned to him and asked him, Simcha, what do you think? And he said, I hate German language. That's all he said. So my mother and me look at each other, what are we going to do? That's him. There were things that he couldn't, there was no place to argue. Mm-hmm. And if you, luckily the ambassador understood that he was not to follow up that conversation, but he was very strong-minded on some things.
And just to understand, so basically he does not suffer ghettoization in Poland.
No.
He didn't suffer deportations, but his story, even though his own individual story is of active fight against,
yes,
his memories or the aftermath, he still suffers as a survivor.
Yeah, sure.
And so did he ever tell you, or did you ever learn how he learned about the history of the family?
When I told you he was in the Jewish brigade, mm-hmm. when they were, it was 46 already, I think, they were in Belgium, and he with 6 more friends took how do you call it? Un camión.
A truck.
A truck from the army, and they went to Poland to look for relatives, and they went all over Poland. He learned, for instance, he went to Warsaw and went to visit a friend, a non-Jewish friend, a family that was from the same town, and went to Poland. And that man invited him for dinner and told him that his older sister, Dvoire, was with them during the war. He hired her she was there as a
maid?
A maid. But then he said a neighbor threatened him to denounce him, so Dvoire went to the ghetto, and then she disappeared. One of the brothers were hiding with, Dvora with his man, with his husband and the 2 children were hiding. That was before she went out to look for food, and when she came back, they were all dead because the Nazis found them. And that's, for instance, the 2 children were killed not by a bullet, but degollados, como se dice?
I don't know. They were
with a knife. Oh. Because the Nazis didn't want to waste bullets on children. Mm-hmm. And then she went to Warsaw and went to work in this friend's home, in this neighbor's home. And that's what he told my father. Mm-hmm. And he said he didn't know much more of that. And then when he was as a soldier after the war, he was in London, he got some letters from some friends, and he learned that. But when they went to look for survivors, they didn't find anyone. My father told me he had a close family and more
distant relatives.
More distant relatives. There were like 200 people, and not one of them survived. He was the only one.
So he carried this anger.
He carried this anger, and he has Moscovich. He worked with the Pitsuim, the
compensation and
the
reparations.
compensation, and Moscovich told my father to ask for the compensation, and my father was so angry that he even dared to tell him, because he said, "How could you put a price on the eyes of your mother?" And he didn't want anything. He didn't want to. He didn't want to be. They invited him to Poland. They invited him to Germany. He didn't want to even to step on the land. I went to Poland. When I went to Poland, it was after my father's death. I went to Poland. I went to his town, to Puławy. I saw this. It was, for me, was like, it was true. All this existed, and it was amazing, amazing.
So what was the connection, or how did your father become involved with the She'erit HaPlita?
Moscovich approached him, and when they made the first She'erit HaPlita organization in Argentina, Moscovich asked him to be the president. I think that's a personal opinion, that it was because it was not in any camp or ghetto. That it was because he was a soldier. He always looked for armies where to get into. But he was also, my father was also, the guilt, the kind of guilt of the survivor had another twist. He once wrote an article called La Pregunta de Antec, the question of Antec. Antec was Antec Zuckerman. Antec Zuckerman was one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto rebellion. Antec Zuckerman was in Argentina, visited Argentina, he and his wife Silvia Lubet. I remember I was like 12 years old or something like that. And they spoke a lot, and Antec asked him why didn't he went back to the Warsaw Ghetto to fight, because Zuckerman and all the leaders of the ghettos, of the rebellions, most of them were out of the Nazi zone, and they went back to organize the rebellion. And my father was so hurt that he didn't know how to answer this question, because he fought, but he fought with armies, not as a partisan. And he was very, very touched by the question of Antec Zuckerman, that why he didn't know. And the article he writes, I still don't know what to answer to that question.
But was he hurt because he understood the question as as a criticism that...
Not as a criticism, as a, you know, I don't think it was a criticism, it was an existential question.
Mm-hmm.
Something like, I don't know, maybe he took it as a criticism, but I think it's more like an existential conundrum,
Mm-hmm.
something like that.
So when you choose your research topic, do you think that you are kind of running these events all the time?
All the time. All this, I know it's present. It's also, I write also. I write poetry, I don't know. It's hard to say about oneself, I am a poet, so that's something others have to say, but I write poetry.
You are a poet?
And I don't know. I write poetry, and I think all this is present in my, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay, I cannot even see it, so.
All this is present, and it's also present in my sons. All this story. I married my children's father he already passed. Was not Jew, but that Jewish history, that Jewish memory is very, very present. It was also present for my husband, but I didn't. My children didn't went to Jewish schools, but they have this Jewish memory very, very present. And for instance, my older son, he went to study high school. He did it at Ort School, and once he told me it's 1st of September, and no one said nothing. It's the day the war started, and he was amazed. Mm-hmm. How come Jewish school? It's not Jewish. 25% of the students at the Ort School in Buenos Aires are not Jewish. It's a very good school also. And he was amazed. And well, but it's a transmission that goes beyond what one plans. Transmission goes by itself.
So you obviously, to do a scholarly research, this is one thing, it's one kind of writing, but to write poetry, it's a completely different type of writing. So can you kind of say a few words how you see these two types of expressions, written expressions, how it forms your, like how your ideas and your worldview and senses come through?
Writing a poem, it's a very liberating activity. Comparing to research and all that, you write a poem and no one will come and ask you, what would you, anything. It's the word I put in a poem, that is the word, no one can argue about it. It's so refreshing, it's so free, so it can be good or bad, I don't know. I don't know if people will like it or not, but it's so free that that's I don't know how else to say it than liberating. And instead, when you write about your research, you have to be careful how to explain, and you get kind of a paranoid mood, because you say, well, I will write it this way, and then if I put this word, someone can ask, and so you anticipate what people will ask, and then you anticipate the answer, and you try to adapt everything in a way that no one will find a place where to go into and attack your work. But with a poem, you're free. You're completely free.
And also in terms of themes or topics, do you think that your research kind of transcends to your poetry in terms of the questions that you ask?
I won't talk about subjects, but words. And in poetry, words are the leading thing, not the themes, but the words. And words are very demanding creatures. So you have to learn to live with them and let them lead you. And not, the theme has nothing to do with the poem.
And but you write in Spanish?
Yes. Yeah.
So how is the literary legacy of your father? How does it kind of influence you?
It's in me. I couldn't say how, but I think it is in me. For instance, I have and I think that's a legacy of my father. When I write, I constantly think, could I translate it into Yiddish, Hebrew? And I think this is a kind of silent conversation with my father, because he worked a lot on translation. His writing was made of translation. I don't translate. I speak Spanish. Is my first language. I write in Spanish. It's my first language, but it's a kind of secret or father's daughter conversation about translating something that I don't need to translate.
And how do you see yourself within today's Argentinian the literary and scholarly life?
I feel very outside of all the literary circles. I do meet with other writers that I really love them and love their writing, but I don't I'm not a part of the literary circles. I prefer to stay outside. It's not
you're not interested in being part of
no, it's like everywhere, you know, when the specialty circles have their own laws and their own special, and you have demands and everything. That's not my place. I read, I write, I give what I write to people. I want them to read what I write, and
that's it.
And that's it.
And in terms of scholarship, do you see around you, especially that you are in a university, do you see around you a circle of people who or students who kind of continue or go with you along the way, or do you see yourself a very lonely?
I feel a little lonely because in the Center for Genocide Studies there are many students, many researchers, and very many of them are senior researchers like me, but they don't specially focus on the Shoah. I especially focus on the Shoah, and that's, I understand it's a very hard subject to stay with it all the time. I remember last year I taught a course on Yiddish literature during the Shoah. And it was very hard for students to keep up with the theme. I noticed it. I use, with these things, what I do is I read in class, because if you read it alone at home, it will be much harder. Mm-hmm. So if we read it together, we can support each other. Mm. And we read a story by Lev Goldin that is called A Chronic of a Day. That is the story of a person, he's a writer, that is waiting for the hour of the soup, the only meal in the day. And it starts very early in the morning when he wakes up, and how it goes by all the hours until the hour of the soup. And one of the students started to feel so hungry that she se descompuso. That she was. And well, these things happen with this, and I'm now working on children in the Shoah, which is even more demanding. I don't know what word to say, and well, it's a little lonely there, yeah.
So there is a growing cohort of young Argentinian
yes.
scholars, and what is your connection with them? Like, how do you see?
I see them. There are, for instance, there are many young scholars in Argentina that are taking the torch on Yiddish studies, which is very interesting. And they are very, very promising. They are very, very promising, like Malena Chinsky, Susana Skura, many. I just don't remember the names right now, but I think that it will be. We will hear about them in the future. They will do very nice work.
Do you think that we should say something else? Like we should discuss something else in connection to your work or your... I also wanted to ask you if you still do pottery.
Ceramics. Not now. I stopped when I started to learn at the university. I went back to university for psychology. I stopped. But I'm very, very, tengo muchas ganas.
You desire to do that
I desire
again.
to go back to this because the feeling of touching the la arcilla, the clay, is very fulfilling. But I don't know. I hope I will, but I don't know.
I hope to. So well, I think, I don't know if you don't...
I would like to thank you
thank you
for this interview and for this visit to this amazing place. I am very, very marveled. by this place, and I hope we keep in touch and
Of course.
go on with the work.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.